In every era of human history, revolutions have reshaped the world. Not only the loud ones that shook empires, but also the quiet ones that unfolded within the human mind. Today we stand at the threshold of such a rebellion, not against kings or governments, but against the invisible forces that shape our fears, our habits, and our sense of possibility. For generations, we've been told who we should be, what we should chase, and which boundaries we must never cross. Yet the greatest transformation begins when we question these stories, when we realize that the limits we accept are often more powerful than the limits that actually exist. A quiet rebellion is the decision to rewrite those stories, to reclaim authorship of our own lives, and to rise, not with noise or anger, but with clarity, courage, and intention. Today, I invite you to begin that rebellion within yourself. A quiet rebellion does not begin on the grand stage of society, nor in the clash of armies, nor in the roar of public movements. It begins in a place far smaller, yet far more decisive, the stories we tell ourselves. Every human life is built upon stories, inherited or invented, whispered into our childhood, etched into our culture, reinforced by our fears, and seldom examined with the rigor they deserve. These stories shape not only the way we interpret the world, but even the boundaries within which we imagine our lives can unfold. They serve as operating systems for our minds, running silently and persistently in the background, dictating what we consider possible, acceptable, or inevitable. And yet, most people walk through their entire lives without realizing that these stories are neither universal nor eternal. They are simply narratives we once needed or believed we needed, but that now quietly restrain our potential. To begin a quiet rebellion is to pause and ask, who authored the story I am living? Some narratives come from our family, woven from generations of experience, fear, and hope. Others come from society, repeating the same definitions of success, failure, worth, and identity. Some originate from trauma, shaping our self-perception in subtle yet powerful ways, and some come from the broader movement of history, pushing us to fit into roles that serve the world as it was, not the world as it could be. The rebellion begins the moment we inspect these stories not with hostility, but with curiosity. Because once we shine a light on them, many will reveal themselves as outdated scripts, written for someone we no longer are. The human mind is wired to love stories. They provide coherence, stability, and meaning. They simplify a complex universe into a form we can navigate. But the same mechanism that helps us survive can also imprison us. We tell ourselves that some dreams are unrealistic, not because they truly are, but because we inherited narratives that equate risk with danger, curiosity with recklessness, or solitude with failure. We convince ourselves that certain goals are too ambitious simply because our surrounding environment never offered examples of people who achieved them. We mistake the limits of our imagination for the limits of the world. A quiet rebellion begins by recognizing that most of our constraints are not physical, but conceptual. Consider how many people live inside a story about what they cannot do. They believe they cannot change careers because they are too old, cannot leave a harmful situation because they are too entangled, cannot pursue a passion because it seems impractical, cannot stand out because it feels unsafe to be noticed. These boundaries often arise not from reality, but from narratives that were formed long before we gained the ability to question them. If we map the edges of our fears, we often discover that they correspond not to the edges of the possible, but to the edges of the familiar. And the quiet rebellion is the courage to step beyond familiarity and into the uncertain space where personal growth occurs. But this rebellion is not about rejecting all stories or living in a vacuum of meaning. It is about authoring new stories instead of unconsciously rehearsing the old ones. When we consciously choose the narrative through which we interpret our experiences, The world no longer appears as a predetermined script, but as an open landscape of choices. This is the most profound liberation a human being can experience. The realization that identity is not a fixed structure, but a dynamic process. That the self is not a prison, but a canvas. With this understanding, even small shifts in the stories we hold about ourselves can fundamentally transform the trajectory of our lives. The stories we tell ourselves affect not only our self-perception, but also the way we relate to others. If we carry narratives of scarcity, we see everyone as a competitor. If we carry narratives of inadequacy, we interpret neutral events as proof of our unworthiness. If we carry narratives of victimhood, we perceive opportunities as traps. Shifting these stories changes the texture of our relationships, the quality of our decisions, and the openness with which we greet the unknown. And yet, the rewriting of inner stories is not a dramatic process. It requires neither loud declarations nor public confrontation. It requires a quiet, persistent observation of the thoughts that shape our emotions, the emotions that shape our actions, and the actions that shape our outcomes. A quiet rebellion is therefore a rebellion of a war. Ines. It begins in the small, private moments when we catch ourselves repeating a belief that no longer serves us. It might be the familiar whisper of, "I'm not ready," or "this is just the way things are," or "people like me don't do things like that." These thoughts appear with such naturalness that we rarely question their legitimacy. Yet the moment we pause long enough to contemplate their origin, we create the first crack in the wall they form around us. Through this crack, new possibilities begin to enter. Possibilities that had always existed but were hidden behind the stories we inherited. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are comforting even when they limit us. A predictable life, even one filled with dissatisfaction, can feel safer than the unpredictable expanse of freedom. Certainty is a seductive narrative. It shields us from responsibility by convincing us that our circumstances are fixed. If we believe that our personality is unchangeable, we do not need to attempt growth. If we believe that failure defines us, we avoid challenges that risk our sense of identity. If we believe that our environment dictates our potential, we remain passive. This passive comfort is one of the most powerful forces that keep people from rewriting their inner narratives. And yet, every meaningful transformation requires stepping into a story that is still being written, one in which the ending is unknown. The quiet rebellion is not a fight against the world, it is a reorientation of attention. Instead of searching for validation outside, we begin noticing the assumptions inside. Instead of focusing on external obstacles, we examine the internal rules we have unconsciously adopted. This internal shift is subtle but revolutionary, because once we change the lens through which we view the world itself appears transformed. A rebelling mind does not simply see obstacles, it sees openings. It does not see permanence, it sees evolution. It does not see identity as a finished product, it sees identity as an ongoing experiment. The rebellion is not loud because it does not need to be. It is powerful because it is conducted in the landscape that ultimately shapes all actions. The mind, to engage in this rebellion, is to become a student of oneself. It requires paying attention to how certain thoughts arise, how they influence our decisions, and how they perpetuate patterns of behavior. Many of these patterns were formed long before we had the maturity to evaluate them. A child believes what they are told because belief is a survival mechanism. A teenager adopts certain narratives to gain acceptance. An adult often continues those narratives simply because they have become comfortable. Yet maturity demands that we periodically audit these stories. Some may still serve us, but many no longer do. Without such an audit, we risk living a life that is guided not by our present aspirations, but by our past conditioning. This rebellion also demands honesty, which is sometimes more challenging than courage. To admit that our limitations are often self-imposed is to confront the uncomfortable fact that we have participated in our own confinement. Yet this honesty is not meant to induce guilt, it is meant to restore agency. If our limitations were imposed solely by external circumstances, then we would be powerless. But if they arise from the stories we hold, then we can change them. The rebellion begins not with the dramatic question of what can I achieve, but with the quieter question of what story am I living and who taught me to live it. The stories we tell ourselves also define our relationship with failure. In many narratives, failure is portrayed as a verdict, a final judgment on our worth. But in a more liberating narrative, failure is simply data, an experiment that yields information about what works and what does not. This shift in storytelling transforms fear into curiosity. Instead of avoiding action, we begin exploring. Instead of shrinking from challenges, we test our boundaries. The story changes from I might fail to I am discovering who I can become. And with this shift, the rebellion deepens. Because the mind is no longer governed by the instinct to avoid discomfort, but by the desire to understand its own capacity. A quiet rebellion also challenges the story that time is our enemy. Many people believe they are too late to begin again, as though life were a linear race with predetermined checkpoints. But time is not a barrier, it is a medium through which transformation unfolds. The belief that we must achieve certain milestones by certain ages is a narrative created by culture, not a law of nature. When we release this narrative, we begin seeing time not as a measure of accomplishment, but as an opportunity for evolution. A person who starts late may see the world with a depth that youth cannot offer. A person who begins again after failure may develop resilience that others lack. The rebellion consists of rejecting the narrative that life must follow a fixed trajectory and embracing the narrative that every moment is a portal to reinvention. In this rebellion, we learn to interpret our past differently. Many people treat their past as a prison, believing that previous mistakes, circumstances, or traumas permanently shape their identity. But the past is not a prophecy, it is a library. It contains information, not destiny. We can choose which memories to learn from, which to release, and which to reinterpret. The story changes from I am the product of my past to I am the author of what my past means to me. This subtle shift gives us back the power that old narratives often steal from us. The stories we tell ourselves also influence how we envision the future. Some people imagine the future as a continuation of the past, a predictable extension of old patterns. But imagination is one of the few human faculties capable of defying gravity. It allows us to envision realities that do not yet exist. A quiet rebellion begins when we allow ourselves to imagine a future that is not constrained by past narratives. Imagination does not need to be grand or unrealistic, it simply needs to be genuine. When we allow ourselves to envision a different story, the mind begins searching for ways to make that story real. The rebellion requires patience. Changing a narrative is not the same as changing a habit. Habits govern behavior, narratives govern identity. When we rewrite the stories beneath our habits, the habits naturally change. This change is slow, often imperceptible at first, like the shift in seasons that only becomes visible after enough time has passed. But with persistence, the new narrative becomes the default, and the old one fades into irrelevance. This is the quiet nature of the rebellion. It does not announce itself with dramatic transformation. It unfolds gradually, then suddenly, until one day we realize that our thoughts, decisions, and behaviors reflect a version of ourselves we once believed impossible. A quiet rebellion spreads inward before it spreads outward. When we change the stories we tell ourselves, we begin influencing the stories others tell themselves, not through force, but through example. A person who has rewritten their narrative becomes a living reminder that human identity is not fixed. Their presence challenges the narratives of those around them, offering a subtle yet powerful invitation. If they can change their story, perhaps I can change mine. In this way, the rebellion is contagious, not through noise or argument, but through the quiet radiance of transformed lives. The rebellion also reshapes our understanding of freedom. Many people think of freedom as the absence of external constraints, but internal constraints are often far more limiting. True freedom arises when we gain the ability to choose which narratives guide our lives. This freedom is not delivered by society, it is created within the self. A person may live in a world full of opportunities and still feel trapped if their internal narrative is one of inadequacy or fear. Another person may face genuine obstacles yet feel empowered because their internal narrative is one of possibility. Freedom is therefore a state of mind long before it becomes a state of circumstance. And so the quiet rebellion continues, often invisibly, always internally. It is the rebellion of waking up each day and choosing to question the stories that dictate our identity. It is the rebellion of refusing to be defined by our past, our environment, or the expectations of others. It is the rebellion of imagining a different future and then daring to live as though that future is possible. It is the rebellion of reclaiming authorship, of recognizing that the most powerful revolution begins not with the world, but with the story we tell about ourselves. Awareness is the most powerful form of resistance because it strikes at the root of every illusion, every manipulation, every misplaced fear, and every unconscious habit that quietly shapes our lives. Most of what governs human behavior operates in the shadows. Assumptions we never articulate, desires we never examine, anxieties we never question, habits we perform automatically, and beliefs we inherit without inspection. These invisible forces guide us more than the decisions we consciously make. The world influences us not only through laws, institutions, or expectations, but through the subtle shaping of our attention. And the moment we become aware of these forces, even in small ways, something profound happens. The machinery of unconscious influence begins to lose its power. Awareness is not a dramatic act. It is not a loud confrontation or a rebellious outburst. It is a quiet, deliberate turning of the mind toward itself. It is the act of noticing what was previously unnoticed. It is the realization that many of the thoughts we treat as absolute truths are simply patterns repeating themselves in the background. Once we see these patterns, they no longer operate with the same authority. Awareness does not always eliminate them, but it loosens their grip, as though a hand that held us tightly is suddenly pried open. This is why awareness is resistance. It resists the passive flow of life in which we drift along with inherited narratives, familiar fears, and comfortable illusions. It resists the temptation to live on autopilot. It resists the systems, internal and external, that thrive when we remain unexamined. Awareness interrupts the momentum of old habits, creating space where new choices can emerge. In that space, the quiet rebellion begins to deepen. Awareness invites us to look at our own minds as though they are landscapes we can explore. Most people live within their minds, but rarely explore them. They react to thoughts as though those thoughts are objective reflections of reality, rather than subjective interpretations created by layers of memory, emotion, biology, culture, and experience. When we believe our thoughts without question, we surrender to them. But when we become aware of their origins and patterns, we begin to reclaim authority over them. A thought loses its power the moment we recognize it as a thought rather than a command. And in that recognition, resistance is born. Consider how awareness transforms fear. Fear is often a response to uncertainty, but just as often it is a response to imagined catastrophes. Stories our minds tell to protect us. When fear arises, awareness allows us to observe the fear rather than be overwhelmed by it. To ask, what exactly am I afraid of? Where is this fear coming from? Is it a memory disguised as a prediction? Is it an old wound disguised as caution? Is it a cultural expectation disguised as logic? With awareness, fear becomes a signal, not a cage. Without awareness, fear becomes a boundary we treat as immovable, even when it is entirely mental. Awareness also reshapes our relationship with desire. Many people chase goals without understanding why they want them. They pursue achievements that offer validation rather than fulfillment. They chase recognition instead of meaning. Desire, when unexamined, becomes an endless cycle that produces restlessness rather than satisfaction. But when we become aware of the motivations beneath our desires, we begin to separate those that come from genuine aspiration from those that arise from insecurity or external pressure. This clarity allows us to choose desires that align with our deeper values rather than those imposed by the stories of society. And this alignment becomes an act of resistance against the forces that profit from our confusion. Awareness is equally powerful in the realm of emotion. Emotions often appear as sudden storms that sweep over us, dictating our actions before we have time to think. But awareness teaches us to step back and observe the emotion as it arises. Instead of saying, I am angry, we begin to notice anger is present. Instead of I am anxious, we notice anxiety is arising. This subtle linguistic shift changes everything. It places a small distance between the self and the emotion. In that distance, the emotion becomes something temporary, something to be understood rather than obeyed. We begin to see the texture of the emotion, its triggers, its sensations, its stories, and once we see it, we gain the ability to respond rather than react. Awareness also extends to the external world. We begin to notice how technology captures our attention, how social norms shape our behavior, how cultural narratives influence our expectations, how institutions frame our sense of what is possible. The modern world is full of systems designed to keep us distracted, compliant, and predictable. Awareness is the one force that disrupts these systems. When we are aware, we do not consume information passively, we question it. We do not adopt opinions reflexively, we examine them. We do not allow the most sensational voices to dictate our worldview, we choose what deserves our attention. This conscious filtering is not about withdrawing from the world, but about engaging with it intentionally. The power of awareness lies in its simplicity. It does not require special tools or extraordinary intelligence. It requires only the willingness to observe. Yet its effects are radical. A single moment of awareness can interrupt a lifetime of conditioning. A single insight can dissolve a belief that once felt absolute. A single pause can prevent a harmful pattern from repeating. Small shifts in awareness accumulate over time, gradually altering the trajectory of a life. This is why awareness is the essence of quiet rebellion. It transforms without spectacle. Awareness also liberates us from the narratives of comparison that dominate modern life. Many people measure their worth through constant comparison with others, comparing careers, relationships, achievements, appearance, possessions, or status. These comparisons create anxiety, resentment, and inadequacy. But when we become aware of the instinct to compare, we begin to see how arbitrary and destructive it is. We notice that comparison rarely leads to growth, but often leads to despair. We see how comparison is fueled by curated images, selective storytelling, and societal values that elevate appearance over authenticity. With awareness, we can choose to shift our focus from comparison to development, from envy to inspiration, from competition to collaboration. Awareness also deepens our understanding of relationships. Many conflicts arise not from genuine incompatibility, but from unconscious patterns of communication, projection, and expectation. Awareness allows us to recognize these patterns. We notice how we respond when we feel threatened, how we interpret certain tones or gestures, how we project old wounds onto current relationships, how we repeat familiar dynamics without realizing it. With awareness, we begin to communicate more clearly, listen more deeply, and respond more compassionately. Relationships become spaces of mutual growth rather than battlegrounds of misunderstood emotion. And this too is resistance. Resistance against the cycles of hurt that perpetuate themselves when left unexamined. Awareness reveals the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is an inevitable part of human life. It arises from loss, change, uncertainty, and vulnerability. Suffering, however, is oft and the result of the stories we attach to pain, the narratives of permanence, injustice, or self-blame that amplify the pain. Awareness allows us to experience pain without multiplying it. It allows us to sit with discomfort without spiraling into catastrophic thinking. It teaches us that pain, when treated with awareness, can be a teacher rather than an enemy. And suffering, when exposed to awareness, begins to dissolve. Another profound aspect of awareness is its effect on choice. Many people believe they are making choices when they are actually following conditioned responses. Awareness reveals the hidden currents beneath those choices. It shows us when we are acting out of habit, fear, avoidance, or expectation. It shows us when we are choosing the familiar instead of the meaningful. The more aware we become, the more our choices reflect our authentic values rather than our conditioning. And each conscious choice is an act of resistance against the unconscious forces that seek to shape us. Awareness also changes our relationship with time. Many people live consumed by either the past or the future. They replay old mistakes, cling to old identities, or relive old wounds. Or they project themselves into imagined futures filled with anxiety, expectation, or fantasy. Awareness brings us into the present moment, not as a spiritual cliché, but as a practical foundation for clarity. The present moment is the only place where choice exists, where transformation happens, where consciousness operates. When we become aware of the present moment, the past loses its grip and the future loses its threat. We become grounded, focused, and receptive to what is actually happening rather than what we fear or expect to happen. Awareness also reveals the subtle ways we avoid ourselves. Many people distract themselves to escape inner discomfort through entertainment, busyness, social media, or constant productivity. These distractions offer temporary relief but prevent deeper understanding. Awareness interrupts this escape. It invites us to look inward, to notice the discomfort, to explore its origins. This exploration can be challenging, but it is the path to growth. Without awareness, we numb ourselves. With awareness, we transform ourselves. Awareness is not passive. It is an active engagement with reality. It is the willingness to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be. This clarity is powerful because illusions cannot survive in its presence. Many fears diminish when examined. Many insecurities weaken when understood. Many conflicts dissolve when illuminated. And many limitations fall away when recognized as self-imposed. Awareness does not eliminate all struggle, but it changes the nature of struggle. Instead of fighting imaginary enemies or resisting uncomfortable truths, we begin working with reality rather than against it. Awareness also uncovers the distinction between the self we think we are and the self we truly are. The self we think we are is constructed from labels, roles, achievements, failures, and external validation. It is fragile because it depends on conditions outside our control. The deeper self is not defined by any of these things. It is found in the silent observer within us, the part that notices thoughts but is not limited by them. When we become aware of this deeper self, we experience a form of inner freedom that cannot be taken away. This inner freedom is the ultimate resistance against any force, internal or external, that seeks to confine us. Awareness also reveals the interconnectedness of human experiences. When we become aware of our own fears, we recognize them in others. When we become aware of our patterns, we see those patterns echoed in the people around us. Awareness cultivates empathy because it shows you that much of what we struggle with is universal. This empathy softens judgment, reduces conflict, and opens the door to compassion. And compassion is itself an act of rebellion in a world that often encourages division and self-interest. Awareness deepens